Hi there, and welcome to Master of Horror. These are 3 of the scariest paranormal stories that I've chosen from all the videos and stories that I've posted. These are also based on true stories. If you like what you hear, please like and subscribe. It really helps my channel out. Okay, my friends, now let's begin. True, scary, paranormal story number 1, The Mothman. In the 1960s, in West Virginia, Point Pleasant, many paranormal and unexpected sightings occurred. All of these sightings and experiences have been documented by the authorities and the newspapers. In November of 1966, 2 couples went on a date to a World War II dump site in Point Pleasant. They claimed as they were there, a large winged black creature with red glowing eyes chased them out of there. They reported the incident to the police. This marked the beginning of the paranormal events ever documented. The black creature would chase people to the ground. Many times, other people would suffer from bleeding eyes. Some people saw a giant mutated owl flying in the sky. People were beginning to see this Mothman in the sky, flying over their houses, and even in their backyard. A resident claims that there was a Mothman standing by a tree about 7 foot tall, staring right at her as she was in her kitchen. She claims as she looked out the window and saw it, it had red glowing eyes. She said it then took off and flew into the sky. She swears on everything that it was not a bird or any other type of flying animal, and it was definitely not a human. Around this time, when things were getting really bad, the Washington Post, which is a newspaper company, heard about all the sightings that were occurring in West Virginia, Point Pleasant. John Klein, a reporter for the Washington Post and researcher, was sent to Point Pleasant. He lost his wife 2 years earlier in a car accident. He went to Point Pleasant, and there he started his investigation. While there, he had reported on many stories. What follows is an actual documentation of his contact with the paranormal. He was in a motel room, distraught and sitting on the bed. The phone then rang, and John Klein went to pick it up. The voice on the other phone sounded electrical and cut up, but it said,
"Hello, John Klein."
"Who is this?" replied John. It said,
"My name is Andrew Gold."
Before John could say anything else, it said,
"Your father was born and raised in Wisconsin. You lived in a greenhouse on Monroe Street, and you don't remember how your mother looked."
John knew this was not a hoax, so he said, "Okay, you have my attention." He then placed his watch in his shoe and placed his shoe under the bed. He asked the voice on the phone, "Where's my watch?" The voice said on the phone,
"Your watch is in your shoe, under the bed."
John then got up and closed the curtains to his motel room and turned off the lights, hoping that no one was looking in. He then sat back down on the bed, picked up chapstick and put it in his hand. He picked up the phone and asked, "What is in my hand?" Slowly, an electrical voice said,
"Chapstick."
At that point, John Klein became even more fearful of who he was speaking with. He got on the ground and pulled a book from the nightstand and quickly asked the entity on the phone, "Read me line 3, page 55. The entity said it word for word. John sat up for a few seconds and asked the entity, "What do you look like?" The entity replied,
Why, it all depends on who's looking.
His next question was, "Can I please meet you?" The entity again quickly answered back and replied,
You already have, John. You already have.
The last question and the most important question in this conversation that John asked was, "What happened to my wife?" The entity then said,
You saw what happened to her. You were there. You cannot find her by looking. You will see her in due time.
The phone then flew off of John's ear through electrical static, and that was the end of the conversation with the entity. John Klein had an actual conversation with the Mothman. After the collapse of the bridge in West Virginia, Point Pleasant, in 1967, the sightings and the paranormal activity calmed down greatly to the point to where there was very little activity that was documented. Scariest and creepiest paranormal story number 2, the haunted Tallman bunk beds. In Wisconsin, in early February of 1987, Alan and Debbie Tallman purchased bunk beds at a second-hand shop. They stored them in their basement. 3 months later, in May of 1987, they moved the bunk beds upstairs to their kids' bedroom. This marked 9 months of paranormal and terrifying experiences for the family that has ever been recorded. Strange occurrences begin to happen nightly. The first night, the bunk beds were upstairs. Their oldest son went into his parents' room claiming that his radio clock was playing music by itself and turning through different stations on its own. Alan, the father, got upset thinking that his oldest son was being immature and just playing around, and took the radio away from him and warned him to behave. Another night, as their kids were asleep, they were awoken by something or someone crawling on the ground, portraying a dog and growling at them. Even though it was dark in their room, they could still see the outline of a dark shadow crawling in and out from underneath their bunk beds. Also, their daughter would explain that there was a fire in her room. When Alan and Debbie went to investigate, they found nothing. About a week later, one quiet night, Alan and Debbie heard their daughter screaming. When they came to see what was wrong, she claimed there was a witch with red eyes behind her bedroom door. Later that week, Alan Tallman came home from working night shift around 2 in the morning. After pulling in the driveway and getting out of his car, he began to hear howling in the wind. The wind began to pick up and the howling got louder. He then heard a voice say, "Come here," from around the side of the house. He walked over to the side of the house and there was nothing there. When he came back around the corner to the front of the garage, to his shock and to his horror, the garage was on fire with flames reaching past the rooftop. He quickly went into his house to retrieve a fire extinguisher, and when he came back outside, there was no fire, nor any indication of one. He walked inside his house and closed the front door in disbelief. As he reached down to pick up his lunch kit, it was thrown across the living room by an unknown entity. There was a night where Mr. Tallman had to go to work and asked his brother Todd to stay the night with his family to protect them from whatever was haunting their house. That night, around 2 in the morning, Todd was asleep on the floor of the kid's bedroom when he was awoken by a noise he heard coming from the closet. Fog began to slowly appear out of nowhere. He then sat up and stared at the closet door as it began to slowly open. What happened next will forever be a secret that no one knows. A bright light filled the room, and Todd witnessed something truly terrifying. He screamed and sat up, petrified, with no emotion on his face. We will never know what he saw, and to this day he doesn't want to tell anyone. He never said exactly what he saw at that moment. But Debbie entered the room and began to grab her children. She asked Todd what did he see, but he did not answer her. He slowly walked out of the room like a zombie with no facial expressions at all. After about a minute, he then snapped out of it and began to get the rest of the kids out of that house, and they left the house that night. The family then immediately had the bunk beds crushed by a bulldozer, and not long after that, they moved out of their house, hoping that the ghost or entity would never follow them ever again. Scariest and creepiest paranormal scary story number 3, the Tatums. In the mid-1980s, in a quiet suburb near Atlanta, Georgia, Jim and Kate Tatum built a new home with plans to retire. But 5 months after they moved into their new home, the Tatums began to experience a series of paranormal occurrences that would ultimately force them to put their house for sale. One night, Kate Tatum could not sleep. She felt something was watching her outside her bedroom. When she got up to investigate, she saw a glimpse of a dark black figure walking past her open doorway. She told her husband Tim, and he searched the whole house with nothing to show for. Shortly after the incident, Kate began to just suspect that it may not have been an actual person, but maybe a ghost or a demon. 2 months later, one night in March, Jim was working upstairs on the house. He stopped working when Kate called him for dinner, and he unplugged his drill and put it to the side. As the evening wore on, Jim decided to watch a movie, while Kate went upstairs to read a book. 1 hour later, Kate heard the sound of the drill outside her bedroom. She thought Jim was teasing her about having seen a ghost, but before long she felt that the joke had gone on for way too long, and got up out of bed and walked into the hallway. It was empty, and the drill was unplugged, laying on the ground. When she knelt down to touch the drill to see if it was warm from being used, it was ice cold. Jim then bought Kate a bell to ring when she needed something. It was an angel bell that he had bought at a garage sale. This was because she had a surgery and was having trouble getting up out of bed, and he didn't want her to move around too much, especially after the surgery. One night, Jim heard the bell ring. That's right next to her as she was sleeping. He went to go see what Kate needed. He found that Kate was sound asleep and the bell had not been moved. After the 3rd time of this happening, Jim had gotten tired of the teasing of the ringing bell by a ghost. So one day, when Jim and Kate were at the breakfast table, he whispered to her that only after ringing the bell 3 times, he would go up to see what Kate needed. But she would have to ring it 3 times, not once. Then and only then would he come upstairs. That very night, while Jim was downstairs watching TV, the angel bell rang 3 times, just as they talked about. Believing this time it was truly Kate, Jim went upstairs to see what she wanted. But again, to his shock and horror, Kate was sound asleep. Jim knew full well that something, an entity or a ghost, must have been hearing them, because not only did they say this to each other, but they whispered it. Jim picked up the angel bell and placed it on the dresser across the room, far away from Kate. As he walked away from the bedroom, through the doorway, the bell rang a 4th time. Jim said he got chills running up and down his arms. He said he felt as if something was standing right next to him and looking at him. The fear he felt at that moment was unexplainable. The Tatums later moved out of their home.